The United Nations highlights the plight of about 258 widows around the world on June 23 every year. So how are widows treated in countries across the African continent? Well, according to the United Nations, widows often confront a denial of inheritance and land rights, degrading and life-threatening mourning and burial rights, among several other forms of widow abuse. African widows are, for the greater part, treated as subhuman. They lose their fundamental human rights immediately after losing their husbands. Widowhood is not only stigmatized in Africa, but is also seen as a source of shame. And to regain social status, widows are expected to marry one of their husband's male relatives, sometimes unwillingly. For many, the loss of a husband is only the first trauma in a long-term ordeal, because when an African husband dies, especially young, there is a presumption his wife killed him. A social media user recently fumed on Twitter after her friend was forced to drink the water used to wash the corpse of her husband, and that was to supposedly prove her innocence. So from a requisite cleansing to days of confinement without a shower, to widow rape, to sleeping by her husband's corpse, to denial to keep their property, the persecution faced by millions of widows on the African continent are just enormous. And now from the Center for African Studies, University of Copenhagen, Denmark, Dr. Primus Tazanu is a sociologist who now joins us to discuss some of these ordeals. Good to have you with us, Doctor. Let's just dive straight into this. It's 2019, and I want to understand why we still find so many widows being subjected to dehumanizing cultural and ritual practices, which often pass for mourning rites.
There's this perennial attempt by the society to always put women in an uncomfortable position. I mean, we live in a patriarchal society whereby the woman is not supposed to have power, be it economic or political or in other forms. So if they are forcing the woman to drink water that has been used to clean the corpse of her husband, it is just to make sure that they dehumanize her. They would like to disenfranchise her. They would like to disinherit her, because in most African societies, the woman is not supposed to own property. We should be very uncomfortable with such practices.
And Doctor, in much of Africa, marriage is the sole basis for women's access to social and often economic rights. And these rights are unfortunately lost upon widowhood, even though we have laws that claim to protect the widows. What do you really think accounts for this?
In most African societies, we have these lofty laws that talk about this or that right for the women. But when it comes to implementation, we are somehow lacking. I could quote an example in Zimbabwe whereby a couple of years ago, there was this woman who was a former MP, very powerful, a feminist. She was actually kicked off her property by her in-laws after the husband died. I think they were married for about 12, 13 years or so. We should think more about the implementation of the law.
That's quite unfortunate. And lastly, Doctor, going forward, what would you advise administrative, cultural and religious institutions to do in order to provide these widows a foothold in society?
We have to also educate our women, not only the women, I mean the society at large, that the women are not supposed to be seen as a property of the men. The women are not supposed to be seen as second-class human beings. If we were called to advise the widows, I would tell them to always seek the law. That is the first thing. And I will also tell the authorities to make sure that they implement the laws. And then we also need the civil society organizations to work hard in exposing these practices that are keeping our women in the uncomfortable position that they occupy in the society. And one thing we have to make the in-laws understand is that the woman you are trying to maltreat could be your sister, she could be your daughter, she could be your mother, she could be a lovely wife that you left behind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tazanu. Well, unfortunately, while widows continue to undergo several cruelties in society, the impunity for abuse of their rights is rife, and that's thanks to cultural and sometimes religious justifications, as well as very, very weak justice systems. So do you want to share with us how widows are treated in your tribe? Get to us on Facebook and on Twitter at Claudia Nsono. A big thank you to you all for watching this week's episode of the program.